The Shattered Dream. The rain fell heavily over the quiet town of Ashton Creek, a small American community tucked between old highways and forgotten factories. The church bell of St. Matthew's Chapel rang softly through the stormy evening. Inside a modest wooden house nearby sat Richard Hale, a grey-haired man in his late 60s with tired blue eyes and trembling hands. To the town, he was just an elderly retired mechanic who kept to himself. But Richard carried secrets heavier than chains. For over 40 years, he had lived a life built on deception. He had once been known in underground circles as the Ghost, a man who could outsmart security systems, manipulate banks, forge identities, and disappear without leaving evidence. He cheated corporations, conned wealthy businessmen, laundered money through fake companies, and escaped every trap the authorities laid before him. He wasn't violent. His weapon was intelligence. And for decades, he believed intelligence without conscience made him untouchable. Richard grew up poor in Chicago during the 1970s. His father died early, and his mother worked endlessly to feed 3 children. Richard was gifted, exceptionally gifted. At 16, he could bypass electronic locks. At 19, he hacked financial systems before most people even understood computers. By 25, he had become a legend among organized criminals. But unlike the violent gangs, Richard dressed like a businessman. He spoke calmly, smiled politely, and studied human behavior like a scientist. People only see what they want to see, he often said. He built fake investment firms, manipulated corrupt executives, and scammed greedy millionaires who thought they were exploiting him. To him, the world itself was a game. And he was winning. But victory came with invisible scars. His wife left him after discovering his secret dealings. His son stopped speaking to him after federal agents raided their home years earlier. Friends disappeared. Partners betrayed one another. Several men he once worked with ended up dead or imprisoned. Yet Richard escaped every time. Each escape fed his arrogance. Until age finally slowed him down. Now in his 60s, he sat alone most nights with silence echoing through his empty house. No family dinners. No grandchildren. No peace. Only memories. One evening, while staring at old photographs, Richard whispered to himself. What exactly did I win? The question haunted him. For the first time in his life, he realized something terrifying. He had spent decades mastering systems, but failed to build a soul. A few months later, Richard began volunteering quietly at a community center near St. Matthew's Chapel. Teenagers from troubled neighborhoods often gathered there. Most adults dismissed them. Richard saw himself in them. Especially 3 boys. Marcus, brilliant with computers. Eli, angry and reckless. Jordan, charming but manipulative. Richard quickly noticed the signs. They were drifting toward cybercrime, robbery, and street fraud. One evening, Marcus proudly showed Richard how he could break into online accounts. Instead of praising him, Richard stared deeply at the boy. You know what the dangerous part is? Richard asked softly. Marcus smirked. Getting caught. No, Richard replied. Enjoying it. The room fell silent. Over time, Richard began telling them stories, not the glamorous versions criminals tell, but the ugly truths. He spoke of paranoia, loneliness, betrayal, sleepless nights, watching every car that slowed near your house, never trusting love, never trusting yourself. At first, the boys laughed. But gradually, they listened. Because the old man spoke with a pain no movie could fake. One stormy Saturday evening, St. Matthew's Chapel prepared for a youth fundraiser. Families gathered inside while rain battered the stained glass windows. Richard sat near the back pew quietly observing. Then the doors burst open. 4 masked men stormed into the church carrying weapons. Everyone down! Screams filled the sanctuary. Children cried. One thief grabbed the donation box while another forced the pastor to kneel. Richard's eyes narrowed instantly. Years of criminal instinct awakened. He studied everything within seconds. The nervous rookie holding the gun. The leader barking orders. The cheap communication radios. The poor positioning near exits. Amateurs. But dangerous amateurs. One of the robbers shouted, "Phone's on the floor. Nobody move." Richard slowly lowered himself beside the pews. His heartbeat remained calm. The old ghost inside him understood fear better than anyone. And he knew criminals often defeated themselves. Quietly, Richard slipped toward the church's side electrical panel unnoticed during the chaos. He smiled faintly. Old habits. Then suddenly, the lights went out. Darkness swallowed the chapel. Panic erupted. But Richard moved with precision. He triggered the fire alarm system manually. Sirens exploded through the building. Red emergency lights flashed violently. Confusion spread among the thieves. "Police are coming," someone screamed. One robber panicked and ran toward the wrong exit. Richard intercepted him with surprising speed, striking his wrist against the wooden railing. The gun slid away. Another robber tried grabbing a hostage, but Richard shouted strategically. "Back entrance! Cops!" Two thieves fled immediately. The leader realized too late they had lost control. Outside, neighbors already noticed the alarms and chaos. Police sirens approached rapidly. Richard cornered the final thief near the fellowship hall. The young criminal pointed a weapon at him with shaking hands. Richard stared directly into his eyes. And for a moment, he saw himself decades earlier. Lost. Angry. Blind. "You still have time," Richard said calmly. The young man hesitated. Then lowered the gun. Police stormed in moments later. The raid was over. The next morning, news spread across town about the elderly man who helped stop the robbery. People called him brave. A hero. But Richard felt no pride. Only conviction. That Sunday evening, he gathered Marcus, Eli, and Jordan outside the church. The rain had stopped. "I need to tell you boys the truth," Richard said. And for the first time in his life, he confessed everything. The fraud. The thefts. The lies. The years wasted chasing money and superiority. The boys listened in stunned silence. Richard's voice cracked as he spoke. "I thought being smarter than everybody made me powerful," he admitted. "But intelligence without purpose destroys you slowly." Marcus finally asked quietly, "So why help us?" Richard looked toward the church cross glowing softly in the distance. "Because nobody stopped me when I was your age." Months passed. Marcus enrolled in cybersecurity school. Eli joined a construction apprenticeship. Jordan began volunteering at the church youth program. And Richard? He continued mentoring troubled teenagers quietly, refusing interviews or recognition. One winter afternoon, Pastor Raymond asked him, "Do you think God forgave you?" Richard smiled faintly. "I don't know," he answered. "But maybe helping others avoid my mistakes is where forgiveness begins." The old criminal never became famous. Never wrote books. Never escaped his past completely. But for the first time in his life, he slept peacefully. And though Richard Hale once spent decades outsmarting the world, his greatest victory came when he finally chose not to outsmart his conscience anymore. Winter settled heavily over Ashton Creek. Snow lined the quiet streets while St. Matthew's Chapel glowed warmly every evening with youth gatherings, counseling sessions, and community dinners. Richard Hale had become an unlikely pillar in the town, though few knew the full depth of the darkness he had escaped. But peace has a strange way of attracting unfinished ghosts. And Richard's past was far from buried. Began on a Thursday evening. Richard sat alone in a small diner across from the church, sipping black coffee while reading old newspapers. The bell above the diner door rang softly. A woman entered. Elegant despite her age. Silver hair tucked neatly beneath a grey wool hat. Sharp green eyes. Calm posture. She moved like someone who noticed everything. Richard immediately sensed it. Not danger. Experience. The woman sat 3 tables away, ordered tea, and casually unfolded a newspaper. But Richard noticed something unusual. She never once looked directly at the menu. Instead, her eyes scanned exits, mirrors, reflections, and customers. Instinctively. Professionally. Richard's pulse slowed. Only certain kinds of people developed habits like that. After several minutes, the waitress accidentally dropped a tray nearby. Everyone startled except the woman. She remained perfectly calm. That confirmed it. She had lived through chaos before. As Richard prepared to leave, the woman finally spoke without looking up. "You still walk like a man avoiding surveillance." Richard froze. Slowly, he turned. The woman smiled faintly. "I was wondering how long it would take you to recognize another ghost." Her name was Evelyn Voss. Age 64. Former international art broker. Or at least, that was one version of her life. The truth was far more complicated. Years ago, Evelyn had operated across Europe under multiple identities, helping wealthy elites hide stolen fortunes through black market auctions and shell companies. She specialized in moving priceless artifacts through borders without detection. Unlike Richard, she never sought fame or power. She sought freedom. And like him, she eventually discovered that freedom without morality becomes another prison. Over the next few weeks, Richard and Evelyn met frequently. Their conversations became dangerous games of revelation. They never confessed directly. Instead, they tested each other through coded memories and subtle references. "You ever work Montreal?" Evelyn once asked casually. Richard smirked. "Only before the embassy systems upgraded." Evelyn nearly laughed. One snowy evening, Evelyn visited St. Matthew's Chapel during a youth mentoring session. She quietly observed Marcus teaching younger kids basic computer coding. Eli organizing donated supplies. Jordan helping elderly residents carry groceries. Afterward, she walked beside Richard through the snow-covered streets. "You changed lives here," she said softly. Richard shook his head. "I'm trying to repair damage." Evelyn stopped walking. "Maybe repairing damage is changing lives." Her word stayed with him. Weeks later, Evelyn revealed her own dream. She had secretly funded rehabilitation programs for former juvenile offenders in several cities using money she once hid offshore decades earlier. "I spent years helping criminals disappear," she admitted. "Now I want to help broken people reappear." Richard stared at her quietly. For the first time in years, he felt something unfamiliar. Hope. Not youthful excitement. Not reckless passion. But mature companionship. The kind born from scars. But peace shattered quickly. One night, Richard returned home to find his front door slightly open. Nothing inside appeared stolen. No signs of forced entry. Only one object sat on the kitchen table. A vintage silver coin. Richard's face hardened instantly. He recognized it immediately. It belonged to Victor Moretti. A ruthless former criminal financier Richard once betrayed decades earlier during a multi-million-dollar operation in New York. Victor was supposed to be dead. Yet the coin meant only one thing. "I found you." That same evening, Evelyn discovered someone had accessed one of her dormant offshore accounts. Not to steal money. To send a message. A single line appeared in the transaction record. Ghosts should stay buried. Someone from their past was hunting them. Victor Moretti had once controlled financial empires hidden beneath organized crime networks. Charming, patient, and utterly merciless, he specialized in psychological warfare. And he blamed Richard for the collapse of an operation that cost him millions and nearly his life 30 years earlier. But Victor was dying now. Terminal illness. Limited time. and revenge had become his final obsession. Richard wanted to run. Old instinct screamed at him to disappear. Fake identities. Hidden cash. Escape routes. But Evelyn refused. "No more running," she said firmly. Richard looked at her carefully. "You understand who we're dealing with?" Evelyn stepped closer. "So do you." Silence filled the room. Then for the first time in decades, Richard smiled like the old ghost again. Not out of arrogance, but strategy. Together, Richard and Evelyn devised one last operation. Not for money. Not for power. But to destroy Victor's criminal empire permanently. Using their combined intelligence, they began exposing hidden financial routes tied to human trafficking, political bribery, and cyber fraud networks Victor still controlled secretly. Evelyn manipulated old offshore channels. Richard infiltrated communication systems through forgotten backdoors only he could recognize. The two elderly former criminals moved like chess masters. Careful. Patient. Invisible. But this time, they were dismantling darkness instead of feeding it. Marcus, Eli, and Jordan unknowingly assisted through legal cybersecurity work connected to federal investigators. Bit by bit, Victor's empire began collapsing. Accounts frozen. Associates arrested. Safe houses exposed. Victor realized too late who was destroying him. The ghosts had returned. Love in the ruins. One evening after weeks of tension, Richard and Evelyn sat quietly outside St. Matthew's Chapel watching snow fall beneath the streetlights. "We're insane, you know," Richard muttered. Evelyn laughed softly. "Probably." Richard looked at her with tired but peaceful eyes. "All those years," he whispered, "I thought I was too broken to love anyone properly." Evelyn reached for his hand. "No," she said gently. "You were just surviving instead of living." For the first time since his youth, Richard felt warmth stronger than fear. Not excitement. Not obsession. But companionship rooted in truth. Two aging souls who understood darkness. Yet chose light anyway. Victor eventually cornered them inside an abandoned railway warehouse outside town. Armed men surrounded the building. Old enemies. Old sins. Victor, weak from illness but burning with rage, confronted Richard directly. "You ruined my empire," Victor hissed. Richard looked calmly at the dying man. "No," he answered quietly. "Greed ruined it. We just stopped pretending it was untouchable." Before violence could erupt, federal agents stormed the warehouse. The operation was over. Victor Moretti was arrested alongside several international associates. This time, there would be no escape. Months later, Richard and Evelyn transformed an abandoned building near St. Matthew's Chapel into a rehabilitation and mentorship center for troubled youth. They named it Second Horizon. No statues honored them. No headline celebrated their past. Most people never learned who they truly were. But every teenager rescued from crime, every lost soul redirected toward hope, became part of the legacy they never thought possible. And sometimes at sunset, Richard and Evelyn sat quietly together on the center's porch watching young people laugh in the distance. Two former ghosts. No longer hiding from the world, but finally helping rebuild it.